Hey everybody, it's Mr. Haskell, and I'm back with more things that you should know by being alive. And tonight I want to focus on the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. So let's go ahead and get down to brass tacks, I guess. So let's talk about America, the United States before 1854. In the early 1850s, America was expanding westward. It was adding new territories, and of course this raised the big question for the time. Would these new territories allow slavery, or would the territories remain free or free soil? Well, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had settled the issue temporarily by banning slavery north of the 36-degree, 30-minute line in the Louisiana Purchase territory. But as time passes and expansion continues, tensions were on the rise. So, what was the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Well, in 1854, Senator Stephen A. Douglas, a little giant from Illinois, introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the goal of it was to, one, organize Nebraska and Kansas, those two territories, for settlement. And then also to let the settlers in those territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery using popular sovereignty. Effectively, voting for it on their own, making that decision. Now, it breaks the Missouri Compromise. Here's why it's so controversial. So because the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise, this opened new territories above the 3630 line to slavery if the settlers voted for it. Northerners saw this as a huge betrayal, fearing that it would expand slavery into lands that were meant to be free. So, Douglas had hoped that popular sovereignty would let settlers deal with the issue. They would let the settlers decide the slavery question, take it off the plate of Congress, right? But in reality, it just turned Kansas into a battleground as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed to the territory in order to control the vote. So, what was Bleeding Kansas? Between 1854 and 1859, Kansas descends into just this violence and chaos. So you have pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri crossing into Kansas to vote illegally and intimidate the anti-slavery settlers. You had anti-slavery free soilers and abolitionists who then move in to kind of counteract the border ruffians. Both sides will set up rival governments in the territory. So you have pro-slavery forces establishing a government in the city of Lecompton, while anti-slavery settlers create one in Topeka. Violence will then just continue to escalate. So in 1856, pro-slavery forces sacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas. In retaliation, abolitionist John Brown and his followers executed pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek. Kansas becomes known as Bleeding Kansas as this guerrilla warfare and raids and reprisals start claiming dozens of lives as a result. So, what's the reaction to all this on a national level? The violence in Kansas just horrified folks in the North, but it was able to embolden folks in the South with their pro-slavery beliefs. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively splits the Democratic Party along sectional lines between the North and the South. It led to the formation of the Republican Party in 1854, which opposed the expansion of slavery, and in effect we have the death of the Whigs. The conflict in Kansas was a microcosm of the national divide over slavery. So, how does this connect to the American Civil War? The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the violence in Bleeding Kansas proved that popular sovereignty couldn't resolve the moral conflict over slavery. Both of them also fueled sectional tension and mistrust further between the North and the South. And add to this, both the items pushed the country further down the road to civil war, starting in 1861. So you may ask the question, I know I did, why did Stephen Douglas push the Kansas-Nebraska Act? Well, Stephen A. Douglas wanted to open the territories for railroad expansion and settlement. This also would then allow Douglas to say, you know what, we want to uphold popular sovereignty as a democratic principle, taking the heat off Congress. But he underestimated the depth of the slavery conflict, and this act completely damaged his political reputation in the North. Okay, you can tell I'm getting to the end here because I'm about ready to ask, why does the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas matter today? Well, both of these events teach us that laws can have unintended, explosive consequences when they fail to address deep moral divides. The expansion of slavery was not just a political debate. It was a matter of human rights. Local conflicts can escalate into national crises when leaders fail to confront injustice. So, wrapping this up here, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was supposed to let people decide on slavery, but instead it ignited violence in Kansas and set America on a path towards a civil war. If you learned anything new, if you enjoyed the video tonight, hey, like, comment, follow, share, all those normal things for more things that you should know by being alive. Well, because understanding how laws like the Kansas-Nebraska Act fueled conflict shows how decisions and injustices can shape the course of history. Thanks for watching.